Stand up. 2 words. That was all. 2 words, and the entire restaurant went quiet, not gradually, not in waves, but all at once the way a power outage takes a room, sudden and total, and leaving everyone blinking in the dark. The jazz trio in the corner stopped mid-phrase. A man, mid-sentence about third-quarter earnings, forgot what he was saying. A woman, reaching for her wine glass, left her hand suspended in the air glass untouched and did not seem to notice. Harrington's Steakhouse on a Friday evening was the kind of place where quiet conversations shaped things, policy, contracts, careers, the quiet machinery of a city running itself. Crystal chandeliers threw amber light across mahogany walls and white linen tablecloths. The smell of dry-aged beef and cedar and money hung in the air the way it always did, warm and certain and completely undisturbed. Until now. I said, "Stand up, hands behind your back." The voice came from somewhere near the entrance to the main dining room. It was loud, not because it needed to be, but because its owner had made it loud on purpose the way some men make themselves loud in rooms where quiet is the custom, because disruption is the point. At table 9 in the far corner of the room, a black man in a charcoal suit sat perfectly still. His hands rested flat on the white tablecloth, palms down. Fingers relaxed as though he had placed them there not in response to what was happening, but simply because this was where his hands belonged. A half-eaten plate of oysters sat in front of him, a glass of sparkling water half full, a second place setting across the table waiting for someone who had not yet returned from the lobby. He did not look up immediately. When he did, it was slow, unhurried, deliberate, the way a man looks up from a book when someone knocks at his door because he already knows what it is and has already decided how he will answer it. His eyes were calm. Not calm the way someone forces themselves to be calm when they are frightened. Calm the way deep water is calm because of what is underneath it, not in spite of it. He set down his water glass. The soft click of crystal against linen was the only sound in the room. The couple at the table to his left had gone completely still, their forks suspended over their plates, their eyes wide and tracking between the man in the corner booth and the police officer approaching across the dining room floor. The older gentleman in the tweed jacket 3 tables back had set down his napkin and was watching with the particular attention of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and knows exactly what he is looking at. Leon, the young waiter who had brought the oysters 22 minutes ago, stood at the edge of the kitchen doorway and did not move. Pierre, the maitre d', had taken exactly 2 steps toward the approaching officer before stopping because something in the officer's posture told him with the certainty of 22 years in this business that stopping was the right thing to do and that what was happening at table 9 was going to matter long after tonight. The man in the charcoal suit looked at the officer coming toward him. He did not panic. He did not speak. He simply waited, with the patience of a man who has spent his life in places where patience was not a virtue, but a survival skill, and who has learned in those places that the most powerful thing a person can do in a moment like this is refuse to be moved. His name was David Okafor, and he had been here before, not in this restaurant, but in this moment. He had arrived at Harrington's at 6:45, which was 15 minutes before the reservation, because that was how David Okafor had always operated in restaurants and in life, showing up before anyone expected him settling in, understanding the terrain before anything happened that required a response. He was 38 years old, though most people placed him somewhere in his early 30s, which he suspected had less to do with his face and more to do with the quality of stillness he carried, the kind of stillness that made people unconsciously think he had more time ahead of him than behind, because men who move through the world that quietly seem somehow exempt from the usual arithmetic of age. He was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy attached to a special warfare unit whose official designation was classified at a level that most people in the building where it was classified did not have clearance to know. He had spent the last decade in the dust of the Kandahar Valley, in the dense green shadows of the Colombian jungle, in the freezing black water of the North Atlantic at 2 in the morning, with a rebreather strapped to his chest and a target 300 meters ahead. He had been shot at in 4 countries and had never been hit, which he credited not to luck, but to the discipline of never being exactly where the other person expected him to be. Tonight, he was in a corner booth at Harrington's Steakhouse in Norfolk, Virginia, eating oysters and waiting for the man who had in many ways made him who he was. Rear Admiral Raymond Holt. 63 years old. 4 stars. 40 years of service in the United States Navy and David's mentor since the day 15 years ago when a then-Lieutenant Holt had watched a 23-year-old ensign from Atlanta named David Okafor refuse to quit a Hell Week evolution that had already broken 11 of the 14 men who started it with him and had decided watching that this was someone worth knowing. Holt had excused himself to the front lobby 20 minutes ago to take a secure call from the Pentagon. Something that happened regularly enough in his life that it barely warranted comment, and David had ordered the oysters and settled in with his water and thought about the evening ahead, which was for once entirely uncomplicated. The promotion had been confirmed 3 weeks ago. Full commander. It was a rank David had not chased. He did not chase things as a rule, but had moved toward steadily through 15 years of work that had been its own reward in the doing of it. And he was glad for it now. Not because of what it meant for his own career, but because of what it meant for the men under his command. A commander had resources. A commander had reach. A commander could protect his people in ways a lieutenant commander sometimes could not. And it was for that reason, and almost no other, that David had allowed himself to feel something close to anticipation when the papers came through. Tonight was the celebration of that. A quiet dinner. A good bottle of wine. The man who had believed in him for 15 years sitting across a white linen tablecloth, telling him probably for the second time in 15 years that he had done well. David did not require the affirmation, but he valued it. There is a difference. His hands, resting on either side of his sparkling water glass, bore the faint tracery of old scars across the knuckles, close quarters, training a knife in Kandahar. The rigging lines of a halo parachute that had behaved badly over the North Sea 3 years ago. He wore a charcoal suit that had been tailored to fit him well enough that the heavy musculature of his frame was present in the suit without being announced by it, the suit of a man who understood that fitting in certain rooms was its own kind of strategy. He sat with his back to the wall. Not from paranoia, the word had never quite described it right, but from the simple operational habit of a man who had spent 15 years in environments where the door you could see was the door you could cover, and where coverage was the difference between going home and not. The habit was so deep in him now that he did it without thinking, the way some people sit in the same seat at the same table every morning without remembering why they started. His eyes, even at rest, moved a slow, peripheral sweep of the room, every few minutes cataloging exits, tracking new arrivals, noting anomalies, and it was a sweep at 6:52 p.m. that caught the movement at the entrance to the main dining room and held it. A police officer. Not in response to an emergency, there was no urgency in the body language. No radio chatter that suggested active pursuit, but moving with the particular purposeful swagger of a man who had decided before he walked through the door what he was going to find. David watched the officer cross the dining room in the reflection of the window across from his table, not turning his head, not adjusting his posture, not doing anything that could be read as reaction. Just watching with the cold, clear attention of someone who has been trained to assess a situation before it becomes a situation. He noted the aggressive body language, the white-knuckled grip on the radio, the eyes scanning the room and locking onto him with the particular quality of recognition that had nothing to do with an actual description, and everything to do with a decision that had already been made. David placed his water glass on the tablecloth, interlaced his fingers, and waited. Because waiting when you know what is coming and you know what you are capable of is not weakness. It is the first move. Harrington's Steakhouse had been in business for 31 years, which in Norfolk, Virginia, where the restaurant industry had a particular brutality about it, was its own kind of achievement, the kind that accumulated not through luck or novelty, but through the slow, stubborn accretion of doing one thing at a time with genuine care. Pierre had worked here for 22 of those 31 years, having arrived from Lyon at the age of 32, with a degree in hospitality management, a deep and unironic love of American steakhouses, and an eagle eye for the particular architecture of a room that was working well versus a room that was beginning to fail, which he could detect the way some people detect weather, not from a single sign but from the aggregate weight of 100 small ones. He knew every regular, every preference. The senator who wanted his ribeye at exactly medium and would not pretend otherwise when his doctor was not looking. The shipping magnate who always ordered the least expensive wine on the menu and left a tip that made the waitstaff visibly emotional. The retired general who came every Thursday with his wife of 40 years always ordered the same table, always held her chair, and was, Pierre had long ago decided, the kindest person who had ever eaten here. He knew David Okafor. Not well. David came perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, always with Admiral Holt, always requesting table 9, but well enough to know the things about a customer that mattered that he arrived early. That he said thank you to the waitstaff and meant it, that he always ordered the oysters first and the bone-in ribeye second, and that he tipped without fail 25%. Leon had been Harrington's for 8 months young, 24, working his way through a hospitality program at the community college, and he had the particular attentiveness of someone who understood that this job done well was a craft, and who was still early enough in the learning of it to be fully present in every moment of it. He had brought Mr. Okafor's oysters at 6:31, had said, "You're welcome." When David thanked him, and had noted with the peripheral awareness of a good waiter that Table 9's second setting had not been filled yet, meaning Mr. Okafor was waiting for someone, meaning the evening was going to matter to him in some way beyond a routine dinner. The restaurant itself smelled of dry-aged beef and cedarwood, and underneath both something older and warmer, the accumulated warmth of 31 years of people sitting down together, leaning across white linen tablecloths toward each other, saying things that mattered in the amber quiet of a room that had been designed to make that possible. The jazz trio and the corner 3 musicians in their 60s who had been playing together for 20 years and had learned in those 20 years exactly how loud to play in a room this size without overwhelming conversation moved through something slow and late night and blue, the melody arriving at each table like a question rather than a statement. Sterling silver moved against bone china with the soft particular music of a room running well. The light was amber and low. The chandeliers dimmed to the exact setting that Pierre had determined in his second year was the difference between a room that felt like a destination and a room that felt like a stop along the way. This was a place where people felt without quite knowing why that they belonged. Not because of the money, though. Money was present and unashamed, but because the room itself communicated a kind of fundamental respect for the act of sitting down together, of setting aside for an hour or two the weight of whatever the day had been, and simply being present in a space that had been carefully prepared to receive you, which was what made what happened next feel like a violation of something sacred. Not just a disruption, a violation. Because there are places, and there are moments, and there are the kinds of men who cannot let either one stand without walking through the door and reminding everyone of their presence. 3 blocks from Harrington's, in the parking lane on the south side of Merchant Street, Squad Car 17 sat with its engine idling, and its driver going nowhere in particular, which had been true of Officer Brett Connolly's career for the better part of a decade, though he would not have described it that way. He was 44 years old, white, broad-shouldered in the way that suggested a body that had once been athletic and had since settled into something heavier and less defined. He had been with the Norfolk Police Department for 14 years, long enough to have a reputation, which was not the same thing as having a record, though in Connolly's case the two things were closer than the Union had ever wanted to acknowledge. He sat behind the wheel with his jaw clenched and his thick fingers drumming against the steering wheel in an irregular rhythm, not the rhythm of a song he was listening to, but the rhythm of a man whose thoughts were moving faster than he could find anything useful to do with them. His career had peaked in year 2. Not in terms of incident reports or citations. Those were fine, steady, unremarkable, but in terms of the internal architecture of who he believed himself to be and what the badge on his chest was supposed to confirm about that. At year 2, he had been certain that the badge made him something. By year 14, he had come to understand on some level he would never have articulated to anyone that the badge had made him something only in rooms where people were afraid of it, and there were fewer and fewer of those rooms in a city that had been changing around him in ways he found deeply personally aggravating. 4 excessive force complaints in the last 5 years, all 4 handled quietly by the Union. Thomas Greer, the senior rep, had navigated each one with the professional efficiency of a man who had done it many times before, and who regarded each navigation as a cost of doing business rather than a signal worth attending to. The complainants, all black men, all from different parts of the city, All describing variations of the same basic experience had filed their paperwork and waited for something to happen, and nothing had. And each of them had learned from that particular silence that the system was not listening. Connolly knew about the complaints. The knowledge did not shame him. It did something worse, it confirmed something. It told him that the machinery was on his side, that the men who ran the system had looked at what he had done and decided it was acceptable, and that this decision constituted in some way he couldn't name, but felt deeply a kind of endorsement. He checked his own reflection in the rearview mirror once then again. A habit so old, he no longer noticed it, and adjusted the angle of his chin by a degree the way a man straightens a frame on a wall that only he can see is crooked. He had been parked on Merchant Street for 6 minutes. The dispatch call had not come yet. This was important not to Connolly, who had stopped paying close attention to the order of things years ago, but to everyone who would later sit in a conference room and look at the radio logs, because what the logs would show with the flat, indifferent precision of a timestamp was that Brett Connolly had parked on the block of Harrington Steakhouse at 7:31 p.m., and that the dispatch call reporting the grand larceny at Wellington Jewelers on 4th Street had come through at 7:37 p.m., and that these two facts placed next to each other told a story that no attorney would be able to explain away. He had not been drawn here by the call. He had been here already, watching. The dispatch crackled at 7:37 grand larceny at Wellington Jewelers, suspect described as a tall male in dark clothing last seen heading north on foot. Approach with caution, the kind of bulletin that floated over the airwaves on a Friday night like smoke, vague and drifting, the kind of description that could mean anything, and often did. To Connolly, it was paperwork, not a lead, not a direction. Just the thing he needed to write in the incident report under the line that said reason for approach, which was a line he had always found annoying, the administrative requirement to justify in language what had already been decided in feeling. He got out of the car. He adjusted his duty belt, the heavy leather creaking in the humid night air, and checked his reflection one more time in the glass of the restaurant window as he approached the door. He pushed through into Harrington's. The transition from the thick, humid Norfolk evening into the hushed amber world of fine dining was, as it always was, jarring in a way he found satisfying rather than humbling, because it confirmed what he already believed that this world. All of this, the crystal and the white linen, and the cedar smell, and the senators in their golf shirts existed at the sufferance of men like him, and that his presence here was therefore not intrusion, but supervision. His eyes moved across the room, over tables of older white men, over women in cocktail dresses, looking, until they found what they were looking for. Pierre saw him the moment he came through the door, and something in his chest tightened in the specific way it tightened when a room that was running well was about to stop running well. Not panic, not alarm, just the quiet, certain knowledge of an experienced man watching a variable he could not control walk through his door. He moved to intercept professionally smoothly the way he had been moving to intercept difficult situations for 22 years, his smile precise, his tone warm, his body angled just enough to suggest redirection without announcing it. "Good evening, officer. Is there an emergency we can assist with?" Connolly did not look at him, did not slow down, said, "Police business. Step aside," without the courtesy of eye contact, and Pierre stepped aside because there are moments when the right thing to do is step aside and watch very carefully. And his hand was already moving toward his jacket pocket where he kept a small notebook before Connolly had taken 3 more steps into the dining room. Connolly's tactical boots thudded against the plush carpet in a way that was deliberately disruptive, heavy, rhythmic announcing, and several conversations faltered at nearby tables as diners looked up with the particular expression of people whose evening had just acquired an unwelcome complexity. His eyes moved across the room. In the reflection of the window on the far wall, David Okafor had already seen him, had been watching the reflection since the moment the front door opened, had already assessed the body. Language had already filed his conclusions, but none of this showed on his face or in his posture or in the placement of his hands, which were still flat on the tablecloth, still perfectly still. David noted the white-knuckled grip on the radio, the aggressive forward lean of the shoulders, the eyes that had swept the room exactly once and then locked onto table 9 without pausing anywhere else, which told him everything he needed to know about whether this was an investigation or a decision that had already been made. He picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, set it back down, and waited. Connolly's chest puffed slightly as he crossed the last 10 feet to table 9. The unconscious expansion of a man performing authority for an audience he was certain was watching. And he was right that the audience was watching only wrong about what they were watching for. The half-eaten plate of oysters in front of David, the single glass of sparkling water, the second-place setting, untouched waiting. The way David was seated upright, unhurried, completely present in the corner with his back to the wall and his eyes on the room. The posture of a man who had selected this seat intentionally, and who was not, by any interpretation, a person who had recently been running on foot down 4th Street. None of it registered to Connolly as evidence. He stopped at the edge of the table, planted his feet wide, rested his right hand with the practiced casualness of 1,000 previous intimidations near the butt of his service weapon. Leon, watching from the edge of the kitchen doorway, felt his stomach turn. "Excuse me." It was not a request. The words landed on table 9 the way a hand lands on a shoulder with weight with claim, and David Okafor looked up from his water glass with the measured pace of a man who had heard the tone before and was not going to reward it with urgency. "Good evening, officer," he said. "Can I help you?" His voice was even, conversational. The voice of a man who had over the course of 15 years been in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong volume had consequences that made this particular moment seem by comparison very manageable. "I need to see some identification." David's brow moved not dramatically, just the small natural crease of a question forming, and his voice remained exactly as it had been. "May I ask why?" Connolly shifted his weight slightly. "You match the description of a suspect involved in a robbery up the street. I need to see your ID now." There were 2 things wrong with that sentence, and David noted them both in the same moment the way a chess player notes a weak move before responding to it. The dispatch had said grand larceny, not robbery, an important legal distinction because robbery involved force or threat of force, and claiming robbery gave the officer significantly more latitude for what came next. And the word now, the particular aggression of it, the insistence on immediacy, as though David had already refused when David had simply asked a question that any reasonable person being approached by law enforcement had every right to ask. He did not point either of these things out yet. "Officer," David said, his voice measured and clear, "I've been sitting at this table for 45 minutes. Leon, that's my waiter, brought me these oysters at approximately 6:31. Pierre, the maitre d', seated me personally when I arrived. The hostess stand will have my reservation in their log under the name Okafor." He paused, not for effect, but for precision. "That's O-K-A-F-O-R. I'm not going anywhere. I have witnesses to my presence here for the last 3/4 of an hour, and I'm happy to answer your questions, but I'd like to understand the basis for this stop." It was not defiance. It was documentation. Every word of it was a timestamp, a witness, a verifiable fact, the careful, methodical construction of a record by a man who understood from long experience that records were the only thing that survived when everything else was contested. Connolly's jaw tightened. The flush that had started at his collar moved an inch up his neck. "I didn't ask you to explain yourself. I asked for your ID. And I'm asking for the basis of the stop," David said with the same tone, the same calm, because calm deployed consistently as its own kind of information. And what it was telling everyone within earshot was that one of the 2 men at this table was in control of himself, and one was not, and it was not the one standing. The couple at the adjacent table had stopped eating entirely. The man, mid-50s, gray hair, the look of someone who had spent a career in law and recognized what he was watching, was very still, his hands flat on the table beside his plate. His wife had her phone in her lap screen facing up, and her thumb was hovering. Leon had taken 1 step out from the kitchen doorway. Pierre had opened his notebook. "You are being uncooperative," Connolly said, and the word uncooperative had a particular life of its own, a word that had in 14 years of incident reports functioned as a rubber stamp that could be pressed onto any interaction that hadn't gone the way Connolly wanted, converting the other person's reasonable response into a procedural failure. "I've answered every question you've asked," David said. "I've given you my name, my location for the past 45 minutes, 3 witnesses to my presence here, and a reservation log entry. If that's uncooperative, I'm not sure what cooperation looks like." He held Connolly's gaze without blinking, not aggressively, not challengingly, but with the steady patient focus of a man who had looked into things much more frightening than this and had found every time that looking steadily was the right response. Connolly's right hand moved slightly, not to his weapon but near it, the way it always moved near it when he wanted someone to understand something without saying it directly, and David's eyes tracked the movement and filed it. He noted the deliberate intimidation tactic, the escalating physical language, the refusal to engage with the specific, reasonable, legally accurate points that had been made. The pattern of a man who was not conducting an investigation but performing one who needed this to look like police work without it being police work. He also noted Leon taking another step forward, and Pierre in his peripheral vision writing something in his notebook with small, careful precision. He said nothing more. He waited. Connolly told David to stand up. He said it with the flat, practiced authority of a man who had said it many times before to many different people in many different circumstances, and who had found enough times to make it a habit that the instruction produced compliance before anyone thought too carefully about whether it was warranted. David did not stand up. Not from defiance, the word wasn't quite right. And it mattered that it wasn't because defiance implies resistance to something legitimate, and what David was resisting was not legitimate, but from the specific practiced decision of a man who understood that standing up in this context would be interpreted in Connolly's incident report as began to resist, and that a man in a charcoal suit making a slow movement to his feet in a restaurant full of witnesses was exactly the kind of ambiguous moment that could be written afterward in any number of ways. He stayed seated. His hands stayed flat on the tablecloth. "I don't believe you have grounds to require me to stand," he said. "If you're detaining me, please tell me what I'm being detained for. If you're not, I'd like to continue my dinner." Connolly's face flushed, the color rising through the skin of his neck and into his cheeks, visible in the amber light, and the flush was not described in Connolly's memory as anger because Connolly did not as a general practice identify his responses as anger. He identified them as authority being challenged, which in his internal vocabulary was a category that demanded a specific kind of response. His fingers flexed, then stiffened. Then he said it. The word arrived at table 9 and landed with a weight completely out of proportion to its 2 letters, the way a single small stone can bring down a wall that seemed solid, until you found the exact right point and everyone in the immediate vicinity heard it. Everyone at the tables within 20 feet heard it. And the silence that followed it was a different quality of silence than the silence before, deeper and more charged, the silence of a room in which something had just been named that had been present all along. "Boy, you need to get up, right now, boy." At the adjacent table, the man in his mid-50s closed his eyes briefly. His wife's thumb pressed the screen. Leon at the kitchen doorway took another step forward and stopped. Pierre's pen moved faster across his notebook. David Okafor did not react. Not in the way people use the word react. No sharp intake of breath. No tightening of the jaw. No change in the position of his hands on the tablecloth. The word had landed. He had felt it land. But the landing of a thing and the permission to let it destabilize you are 2 different things, and David had made a decision a long time ago, in circumstances far more dangerous than a restaurant on a Friday night, that no one, no voice, no word, no gesture, no uniform would take his composure from him, because his composure was the one thing in 15 years of doing what he did that had never once failed him, and he was not going to let it fail him here. He breathed. Once. Slow. He looked at Connolly with the same steady, clear attention he had been giving him since he arrived, not hard, not cold, but absolutely present, and said quietly and precisely, "I'd like you to refer to me by my name, which is Okafor, or by Sir, which is the customary form of address in a professional interaction. I've been cooperative, I've been respectful, I've answered your questions, I'm asking you to do the same." Connolly lunged. Not a word, not a warning. Just the sudden forward motion of his hand reaching for the lapel of David's charcoal suit, his body following the arm, fully intending to haul the man physically across the table and put him on the floor. Because that was in Connolly's world what happened when someone did not respond to the word boy, the way the word boy was supposed to make them respond. His hand moved through the air toward David's jacket. And then it stopped. Not because Connolly chose to stop it, because a shadow fell across the table. The shadow was large. Not dramatically large, not the shadow of a thing that announces itself, but the shadow of a man who had been standing in the archway between the dining room and the lobby for 4 full minutes, watching in the particular way that men who have spent 40 years making consequential decisions watch things before they act on them completely, without rush, storing every detail, waiting for the exact moment when acting would be most useful. Rear Admiral Raymond Holt was 63 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall, and built the way certain old trees are built, not the spectacular bulk of fast growth, but the dense, unshowy solidity of something that has been tested by weather repeatedly over a very long time and has not moved. His hair was entirely silver. His face carried the kind of lines that come not from aging, but from squinting into the sun of 100 different latitudes from decades of reading situations in which the cost of misreading was permanent. He wore a dark civilian suit, well-made, unpretentious, and on the left lapel a single small pin that caught the amber light of the chandelier above him, one gold anchor set behind 4 silver stars. He had returned from his Pentagon call at 7:41 p.m., and had pushed through the lobby door into the entrance of the dining room and had seen from the archway what was happening at table 9 and had stopped. For 4 minutes. He stood in the shadow of the archway and watched, not from hesitation, not from uncertainty, but with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that walking into a situation before it had fully revealed itself was how you became part of the problem instead of the solution. He watched Connolly plant his feet, watched the hand near the weapon, watched the flush climb Connolly's neck, heard the word boy arrive in the room and heard the silence that followed it, and felt in the still cold part of him where his anger lived, the anger he had learned over 40 years to keep cold, to keep useful, to keep precise, something crystallize. He waited until Connolly's hand was in the air. Then he stepped forward. The shadow fell across the table before his voice did the physical presence of him preceding the sound of him. And when his voice came, it came quietly, which was not the same as softly, the way a scalpel is quiet without being gentle. "I strongly suggest you remove your hand." A pause, not for drama, but because the pause was part of the sentence. "Before I have it legally amputated." Connolly froze. His hand hung in the air between himself and David's jacket, suspended ridiculous belonging to a man who had in the space of a single sentence gone from initiating a physical confrontation to standing motionless with his arm extended uselessly in front of him. He turned. The retort was already forming, had been forming since the voice started the reflexive aggressive response of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of an action he believed he had the right to take, and who intended to make the interruption regrettable. The retort died. Completely. He found himself looking at the lapel pin first, not because it was obvious, but because the eye goes sometimes to the thing that matters before the brain has explained why it matters, and even a man like Connolly, whose understanding of military hierarchy was approximate at best, understood with the immediate physical certainty of a man recognizing a thing much larger than himself, that what he was looking at was the kind of authority that made his badge look like a participation trophy. 1 gold anchor, 4 silver stars. The color left Connolly's face with the abruptness of a light switching off. Holt stepped forward, closing the distance until he was chest to chest with the officer, forcing Connolly to tilt his head slightly upward to hold the eye contact which Connolly did not want to hold, but found he could not look away from. And his voice dropped further to the register that 40 years had taught him was more effective than shouting the register that said, "I am not raising my voice because I don't need to. I've been sitting at this table on and off for the past hour." Holt said, his voice a low, steady current. "I was present when my guest arrived at 6:45. I was present for the first portion of his dinner. I returned from a phone call 4 minutes ago, and I have been standing in that archway watching your conduct since before you told a decorated United States naval officer to..." He paused, and the pause was surgical. "Stand up, boy." Connolly's Adam's apple moved. "I have a direct question for you, officer, and I am going to need a direct answer." Holt's eyes blew cold, with the particular clarity of a man who has looked at much harder things than this did not move from Connolly's face. "Articulate to me right now the probable cause you possess to place hands on Lieutenant Commander David Okafor." The handcuffs dangling from Connolly's fingers felt suddenly like they weighed 40 pounds. "He matches a description, sir." Connolly pushed the words out from somewhere below his diaphragm, the last breath of a man who is running out of oxygen, clinging to the standard procedural language the way a person in deep water clings to something that is not on reflection quite large enough to hold them. "Grand larceny. Down on 4th Street. I was conducting a Terry stop to identify a potential suspect." Holt's eyes narrowed by a degree the gesture of a man whose contempt had reached a level of density that required containment. "Do not," he said very quietly, "hide behind procedural language in front of me. I've been watching since before you chose your vocabulary." He took a single half-step closer. "The dispatch call was for a male in dark clothing fleeing north on foot. You found this man sitting in a corner booth eating dinner with a reservation a waiter who brought his food 22 minutes ago and a maitre d' who seated him personally." A pause. "Your suspect was not fleeing. He was dining. From table 9. David Okafor, who had not moved throughout any of this, picked up his water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, set it back down, and spoke for only the second time since the confrontation began in the conversational tone of a man wrapping up a meeting. "Officer Connolly," his voice was smooth, unhurried, terrible in its calm. "In my line of work, we call what you just did a fatal funnel. You walked into an environment you didn't understand, made assumptions based on criteria that had nothing to do with the situation in front of you, and trapped yourself in a position with no tactical advantage and no exit strategy." He tilted his head slightly, a small, precise movement. "You didn't investigate, you hunted. And you hunted because you assumed that the color of my suit and the color of my skin meant you could do whatever you wanted without consequence." He looked at Connolly the way men look at problems they have already solved. "You chose the wrong man," he said. "And you chose the wrong night." Outside, through the thick front windows of Harrington's, the cobblestone street lit up in slow, rhythmic pulses of red and blue, 3 unmarked black SUVs. No sirens pulling to the curb, with the deliberate, unhurried efficiency of people who had been called and who had come prepared. The heavy oak front door of Harrington's opened, and Chief Gordon Walsh walked in his tuxedo bow tie already yanked loose and hanging around his neck with the expression of a man who has just been handed something he has been dreading for a very long time. Chief Gordon Walsh had been at a retirement dinner 6 blocks away, 30 years of service, for a detective named Roy Alcott, a good man someone Walsh had come up with in the department, and the evening had been easy and warm. In the way those evenings sometimes are the particular warmth of a room full of people who have spent their working lives doing hard things together and are marking for one night what that means. His phone had vibrated at 7:52 p.m. He read the text once. He read it again. He set his napkin on the table, said something brief to the woman on his right, and walked out of the room without finishing his dessert. He knew Connolly's file. Not abstractly, not the way administrators know files as numbers and dates and categories, but specifically the way a man knows a problem he has been watching accumulate with the particular dread of someone who sees where it is going and cannot find a clean way to stop it. 4 complaints in 5 years. 4 substantiated by evidence, all handled below the threshold of termination, all sealed by the union with Thomas Greer's signature on the paperwork. Walsh had pushed for a more serious response twice, and had been told twice in the indirect language of institutional diplomacy that the union's cooperation on other matters depended on a certain consistency in how cases like Connolly's were managed. He had made a calculation, and now the calculation had come due. He pushed through the front door of Harrington's and took the room in with a single sweep. The frozen diners, the smartphone screens glowing at half a dozen tables, Pierre standing with his notebook open. Leon at the kitchen door and at table 9. Connolly, pale and diminished with his handcuffs still dangling from his fingers. Admiral Raymond Holt, upright and very still, and David Okafor seated hands on the tablecloth watching the chief's entrance with an expression that contained, if you looked carefully, a very quiet assessment. Walsh crossed the dining room. His first words were to Holt, an acknowledgement, an apology, a handshake that communicated the weight of everything behind it, the institutional failure, the personal horror at being here, the genuine respect of one man for another, and Holt accepted it with the brevity of someone who understood that apologies, while appropriate, were not the point. His second words were to David. Brief, direct, sincere in the way that things are sincere when they are not performed. He thanked him, and what he meant by it was larger than what he said, and David received it with a single nod that said without words that he understood. Then Walsh turned to Connolly. He did not speak immediately. He stood and looked at the man. This man he had read about, worried about, tried to manage from a distance, and what was on his face was not anger alone, but shame. The specific institutional shame of a leader looking at the consequence of a tolerated failure, and understanding that tolerance, however well rationalized, is its own form of decision. Miller, Walsh said, and then stopped himself wrong, named the name of the last one, the name that had been in his head all year, Connolly. He said it with the controlled weight of someone who has been practicing restraint for a long time and is choosing it again now. You've been a problem in this department for 5 years, and this department protected you, and that is on us as much as it is on you. But right now, in this room, in front of these people and this officer, he paused, you have ended it. Captain Diane Mercer moved forward. She had arrived 90 seconds after Walsh. Dark, pantsuit eyes scanning the room with the specific methodical attention of someone who was already building the file and stood beside Connolly with a precision that communicated without theater exactly what was happening. She named the items as she took them. Badge, radio, taser, service weapon. Each one surrendered, each one laid on the empty table beside David's booth, and the sequence of it, the accumulation had a weight that no speech could have matched, because these were the objects of an identity, and they were being removed one by one, and Connolly's hands were shaking by the time the last one left his fingers. Mercer produced zip ties. Not handcuffs, zip ties, and the choice was deliberate. The choice of someone communicating that this was not a professional courtesy arrest, that professional courtesy had exited the room somewhere around the word boy, and that what remained was simply the basic procedural fact of a man who had done something wrong being restrained. The sharp plastic sound of the ties closing around Connolly's wrists was in the complete silence of the dining room very loud. Connolly's eyes filled not with remorse, not with understanding, with the stunned, specific panic of a man whose certainty about how things worked had just collided with how things were and found the gap between them to be absolute. They walked Connolly out through the front door, and the heavy oak closed behind him, and the room was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then, from a corner table near the back, an older man in a tweed jacket began to clap, slowly, alone. His hands moving together with the considered pace of someone making a statement, not a sound, and within 4 seconds he was joined by the man beside him, and within 10 seconds by the table to his left, and within 30 seconds the entire dining room of Harrington's Steakhouse was applauding, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with the sustained specific weight of people acknowledging something they had witnessed and needed to mark. David Okafor did not smile. He picked up his water glass, took a slow sip. The same gesture, the same deliberate calm, the same hands that had been flat on the tablecloth through the entire thing, and set the glass back down and looked at Holt across the table with an expression that was not relief, but something quieter and more durable than relief. Holt looked back at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the applause continued around them like weather, like a room breathing. And then it subsided into the soft resumption of a room trying to find its way back to itself. Leon appeared at the table, not in the practiced, efficient way of a waiter working a section, but with the slightly unsteady, deeply genuine quality of a 24-year-old who had just watched something that he understood without being able to fully articulate it, yet had mattered. And he set a fresh bottle of the 1998 Cabernet on the table with both hands, his fingers not quite steady, and said nothing because nothing was what the moment asked for. David thanked him. Meant it. Holt poured. They sat for a while with the wine and the amber light and the slow return of the jazz trio who had resumed playing somewhere in the middle of the applause, not with fanfare but with the same slow questioning melody they had been playing before, as though the music had simply been waiting for the room to be ready for it again. "I have been in 40 years of service," Holt said, eventually, his voice quiet, carrying the particular thickness of a man who is giving something its real name for the first time in a while. "And I have seen a great many things in a great many places. But there is something about watching it happen here in my city in a room I've eaten in a dozen times that sits differently." David turned his wine glass slowly with 2 fingers. "I know," he said. "It shouldn't be your reality." "No," David agreed. "It shouldn't." He looked at Holt with the steady clarity of a man who had spent 15 years choosing honesty over comfort. "But it is. And what I've learned over time is that the answer isn't to let it make me smaller. The answer is to keep being exactly who I am every time in every room until there are too many witnesses for it to be denied." Holt was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That's the most accurate thing I've heard anyone say in years." At the edge of the room, Pierre sat down for the first time in 22 years of working Harrington's. He sat down while on the clock, pulling a chair from a nearby empty table, and with his notebook open on his knee wrote out by hand in small, careful letters everything he had witnessed, from the moment Connolly walked through the door, time-stamped to the minute with the names of every witness he had identified, and the specific sequence of every event in the order it had occurred. He was still writing when the restaurant closed. Captain Diane Mercer did not go home. She drove from Harrington's to the precinct with the particular focused energy of a woman who had been doing this work for 19 years, and who recognized when a case had this quality of clarity about it that going home was the thing you did after the record was established, not before. She went to the Internal Affairs Records Room. She pulled 4 things: the original 911 audio from the Wellington Jewelers, call the dispatch transcript, the incident arrest report for the suspect who had actually been apprehended, and Connolly's written justification for the stop of David Okafor, which he had filed at 8:17 p.m. from a precinct computer, 40 minutes after he was taken into custody, apparently with the assistance of Thomas Greer's coaching over the phone. She laid them on the steel table in the records room under the fluorescent light and read them in order. The 911 call from the Wellington Jewelers owner, clear audio, clear description. A white male teenager, approximately 5'9", wearing blue jeans, a gray hooded sweatshirt and red sneakers, carrying a black backpack, seen fleeing on foot northbound on 4th Street at approximately 7:33 p.m. The dispatch broadcast at 7:37 describing the suspect as a male in dark clothing, which was the dispatch operator's summary of the 911 description, an imprecise summary, as Friday night dispatches often were the specific details compressed under the pressure of volume, but a summary that, if you had the original audio, was clearly and unambiguously describing a white teenager in a gray hoodie and red sneakers. The arrest report for the suspect, Tyler Bowen, 19 years old, white male, 5'8", gray sweatshirt, blue jeans, red Nikes, apprehended at 8:02 p.m., 2 blocks north of Wellington Jewelers by Officer D. Ramirez of the 2nd District. Bowen had the stolen jewelry in his backpack. The case was closed. Connolly's written justification. Respondent observed a tall black male in dark clothing in the vicinity of the reported crime, consistent with the suspect description broadcast at 1937. Respondent conducted a Terry stop to establish identity and rule out involvement. Mercer sat with these 4 documents for a moment. She placed Tyler Bowen's booking photo beside Connolly's incident report. She placed the 911 audio transcript beside the dispatch summary. She looked at them in pairs, the reality and the version of reality that Connolly had written, and the distance between them was not a gap, it was a fabrication clean and deliberate, and documented from 4 independent directions. Detective Frank Alvarez had been called in at 11. He arrived with the radio log printout, the timestamp record of every transmission, every unit location, every dispatch call. And he set it on the steel table without preamble and pointed to 2 lines. Connolly's unit squad car 17 logged stationary at the corner of Merchant and Harbor, which was the block Harrington's occupied at 7:31 p.m. The Wellington jeweler's dispatch call went out at 7:37 p.m. 6 minutes. Connolly had been parked on that block for 6 minutes before the call that he would later claim had prompted his approach. Alvarez said without drama, without editorial, he was already there. He didn't respond to the call. The call gave him something to write in the box. Mercer nodded once. She read through Connolly's 4 prior complaints pulled from the sealed union files that Walsh had authorized the opening of by 10 p.m. 4 complaints from 4 different men in 4 different parts of the city over 5 years. Each describing a variation of the same encounter stopped without cause, told they matched a description, unable to get a satisfactory explanation, subjected to searches that found nothing, released without charge. Their complaints absorbed by the machinery and sealed by the union before anything could come of them. The men's names: Marcus Dillard, a middle school principal; Dr. Carl Pemberton, an emergency physician; Reggie Tate, a building contractor; James Osei, a grandfather walking his 7-year-old granddaughter to school. Mercer read each name aloud to herself quietly in the empty room. She set the complaint files beside the Tyler Bowen booking photo and Connolly's incident report and looked at the table as a whole. The whole table. Everything on it, and what she saw was not a collection of individual incidents, but a record, a through line, a pattern that had been present and protected for 5 years, and that had finally, on a Friday night in a steakhouse on Harbor Street, run into the one person in the room who had the standing, the knowledge, and the witnesses to make the pattern visible. She turned to Alvarez. Make copies of everything. Radio logs, dispatch transcripts, 911, audio, all 4 complaint files, Bowen's arrest report, and Connolly's incident report. I want all of it certified and on Chief Walsh's desk before 7 a.m. Alvarez was already copying. Mercer picked up her phone and called Special Agent Clara Bowen of the FBI Civil Rights Division, whom she had worked with once before on a case that had taken 18 months and had ended with a conviction, and said simply, "I have something you need to see. Can you be here in the morning?" Clara Bowen said yes. The fluorescent light hummed. The documents were copied, certified, and stacked. And in a holding cell 2 floors above Brett Connolly sat on a metal bunk in the particular silence of a building that knew what he was and waited for morning. The holding cell was Room 4B, which was a designation rather than a description. There was no distinguishing quality to it that made it Room 4B rather than any of the other cells except its location at the end of the corridor, and the fact that its fluorescent light had been humming at a slightly higher frequency than the others for 3 years, a maintenance issue that had been reported twice and never repaired. The light never fully went off. It ran at the same level of flat, indifferent brightness at 3 in the morning that it ran at 9 in the evening, and there was something about that consistency. The way the light refused to acknowledge the difference between being awake and trying to sleep, between daytime and nighttime, between the arrival of a new hour and the departure of an old one that had its own particular quality of punishment. Connolly sat on the edge of the metal bunk with his forearms on his knees and his hands hanging between them, still wearing the uniform he had arrived in, minus the badge and the belt and the weapon and the taser and the radio, all of which were now in labeled evidence bags in the processing room 2 floors below, tagged with his name and the case number that had been assigned at 8:31 p.m. He had been in this building for 14 years. He had walked past 4B hundreds of times in the other direction, had heard from the outside the particular quality of the doors, the quality of the lock, the quality of the silence beyond it, and the familiarity of all of it experienced now from the inside was something that had no adequate word, sitting somewhere between irony and just consequence. He made 2 phone calls. The first was to his wife Patricia. At 10:15, the phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and he listened to her voice on the recording say, "Please leave a message," which he did not, because what he needed to say had no shape yet, was still something he was carrying around inside him. Unformed, the raw material of understanding that had not yet been processed into language. The second was to Thomas Greer, who picked up on the second ring, his voice carrying the specific exhaustion of a man who had been waiting for this call and had spent the waiting time calculating how bad it was. "Thomas," Connolly said, "I need you here." There was a pause on the other end. The pause of a man weighing something, and Greer's voice when it came back was careful in the way that lawyers are careful precise without being warm. He would be there in the morning. They would go through it together. It was going to be complicated. Complicated. The word settled into the room with the same flat, buzzing persistence as the fluorescent light. Connolly lay back on the bunk, not to sleep. He understood that sleep was not going to come tonight and looked at the ceiling, which was the same ceiling as every other room in this building, the same institutional plaster, the same water stain in the corner from a pipe that had been repaired 3 years ago, without quite resolving whatever had caused it. He had a daughter. Her name was Lily, and she was 12 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she was the person in his life who had, without trying, managed to make the rest of it feel like it had a coherent reason. He took out his wallet. They had let him keep his wallet, standard procedure for an officer on administrative hold rather than criminal booking, and found the photograph behind his library card, a school photo from last spring. Lily in a navy cardigan, with her hair in 2 braids. He looked at it for a while. The question that rose in him was not, what will this do to my career, or what will happen in the morning, both of which he had some capacity to imagine, but a simpler and more unanswerable question, which was, what will she think? Not today. Not when she first hears he could predict that conversation in its rough outlines. The stunned quiet, the careful words, the management of a situation. But later, when she was older, when she was the age he was now, when she could look back at this night with the full understanding of an adult, what would she see when she thought about her father? He did not know. He put the photograph away. The light hummed. Outside the cell above him, around him, in the floors below the building, was processing what had happened with the efficient, unstoppable motion of a machine that had been set in motion and could not be stopped. The footage from 6 smartphones, 4 in the dining room, 1 from Leon at the kitchen door, 1 from a pedestrian who had been passing the front window and had seen through the glass enough to stop and record, was circulating on 3 platforms by midnight. The phrase 4-star Admiral had moved through the department with the speed of something that everyone recognized as consequential and no one quite knew how to manage. By 2 in the morning, the mayor's office had called Walsh twice. By 3, 2 national news outlets had filed requests for the incident report. And in room 4B, the light hummed on and Brett Connolly lay on a metal bunk with his wallet in his pocket and a daughter's photograph behind his library card and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep. The conference room on the top floor of the Norfolk Municipal Building had no windows. Not because someone had made a design choice, but because the building had been expanded in stages, and the top floor was the part that had been added last when the budget had been smaller and the priorities elsewhere, and so it existed in a condition of sealed fluorescent permanence that made every conversation that happened inside it feel to the people having it like something that could not be walked away from. This was not unintentional. Walsh had chosen this room. 3 days after the incident at Harrington's, Brett Connolly sat at the long mahogany table in a gray suit that was not quite the right fit, too short in the sleeves, too wide in the shoulders, and looked nothing like the man who had walked into Harrington's with his duty belt and his reflection and his certainty. He looked like someone who had spent 3 days not sleeping in the specific way that guilt and fear combine to produce an exhaustion that rest cannot touch. Beside him, Thomas Greer, senior union representative, 23 years in the role, a man whose face had the weathered professionalism of someone who had sat in the rooms like this many times and had most of those times managed to locate a livable outcome. Somewhere in the available space was checking his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes and avoiding eye contact with the people across the table, which told Connolly if he had been watching something important about the space that was available today. Across the table, Chief Walsh, Captain Mercer, Detective Alvarez, and at the far right of the table a woman Greer had not expected, and whose presence was the reason he was checking his watch. Special Agent Clara Bowen of the FBI Civil Rights Division, who was 41 years old, had 11 years in the division, and had placed a single manila folder on the table in front of her when she sat down and had not opened it since. Walsh opened his binder. The cracking of the spine was the loudest thing in the room for a moment. This proceeding, Walsh said in the flat, deliberate voice of a man reading from something he had written the night before and revised twice, is the formal conclusion of the internal affairs investigation into the conduct of Officer Brett Connolly on the evening of Friday the 17th. The investigation was completed in 72 hours. He looked up from the binder. Mr. Greer, your client has been advised of his right to counsel. Do you confirm he has chosen to proceed with union representation only? Greer said yes. Walsh looked at Connolly. Are you prepared to hear the findings? Connolly said yes, barely above a whisper. Speak up, Walsh said, not unkindly but not gently either. Yes, Chief, Connolly said louder. Walsh looked down at the binder. And the room, with its sealed walls and its fluorescent light and its complete absence of windows and its long table and its accumulation of documented consequence, settled into the specific, weighted quiet of a place where things were about to be said that could not be unsaid. Mercer took over from Walsh with the practiced efficiency of someone who had organized this presentation 3 times in her head the night before and had arrived this morning knowing precisely the order in which each piece would land. She opened with the dispatch transcript. Not with commentary, she simply slid a copy across the table to Connolly and Greer and read aloud from her own copy and let the words do what they did. Male in dark clothing. Fleeing north on foot, the dispatch summary. Then, from the original 911 audio transcript played on a small recorder set in the middle of the table, the jewelry store owner's voice clear and specific describing a white male teenager in a gray hoodie and red sneakers. The recorder clicked off. Mercer said, the dispatch call that you cited as your basis for approaching Commander Okafor described a suspect who by the full 911 record bore no resemblance to Commander Okafor in any dimension. She did not pause for a response. She moved to the next document. The radio log certified with Connolly's unit location time-stamped stationary at Merchant and Harbor the block, Harrington's occupied at 7:31 p.m. The dispatch call, 7:37 p.m. 6 minutes. Mercer placed her finger on the timestamps without saying anything and let the 6-minute gap speak for itself because it was better than anything she could have said. Then Tyler Bowen's booking photo. She placed it on the table. A standard booking photograph, a white teenager with his name and date and case number printed at the bottom and beside it Connolly's written description of the suspect he claimed to have been responding to. She did not comment. She let the room read both. Connolly looked at the booking photo for 2 seconds, then looked at his hands. Greer cleared his throat. The dispatch description was a compressed summary of a 911 call that described this young man. Mercer gestured to the booking photo without touching it. The full audio has been certified. It's in the record. There is no interpretation of that audio that produces a description matching Commander Okafor. She moved to the smartphone footage. The recordings from 6 devices 4 angles were played on a laptop positioned so that everyone at the table could see. 47 seconds of Table 9. A man eating oysters, a police officer, arriving the sequence of the confrontation in complete unedited detail, including the word that landed in the restaurant at 7:44 p.m., which was captured with perfect clarity from the device of the couple at the adjacent table. Connolly did not watch the footage. He watched the table. Then the prior complaints. Mercer read the names aloud. Marcus Dillard, Dr. Carl Pemberton, Reggie Tate, James Osei, and for each one she read a single sentence from the original complaint, the date, the location, the substance of what had happened, and the phrase that appeared in all 4 told me I matched a description. No charges, no suspects. 4 men stopped and subjected to searches and released. 4 complaints sealed by the union. She placed Greer's signature on the sealing paperwork in front of him, a photocopy clean and unambiguous, and Greer looked at it with the expression of a man who had been hoping until this moment that the room had not known about that. Mr. Greer, Mercer said with a tone that was precise and entirely without cruelty, the union's role in managing these complaints will be a separate matter. It is part of this record. Greer's watch stopped being interesting to him. Special Agent Clara Bowen opened her manila folder. She removed a single document and placed it on the table in front of Connolly with the unhurried motion of someone who has been carrying something for a while and is setting it down at last. "Officer Connolly," she said, "the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division is filing federal charges under Title 18 United States Code Section 242 Deprivation of Rights under color of law. The conduct documented in this record, including the pattern of prior incidents, meets the threshold for federal prosecution." She paused. "This proceeding is not your only proceeding." The room was very quiet. Connolly's hands flat on the table were not steady. Thomas Greer cleared his throat again, a habit. He reset the physical equivalent of reaching for language that wasn't quite there, and began the offer he had spent 3 days constructing. Mandatory retraining. Unpaid suspension minimum 60 days. Early retirement with a reduced pension structure. No admission of wrongdoing in the formal record. He delivered it with the practiced calm of a man who had made offers like this many times before, who knew their shape and their timing and the specific vocabulary that made them sound reasonable, and who was watching as he spoke for the particular shift in the room that told you whether the offer was landing. The shift did not come. Walsh waited until Greer had finished, let the offer sit in the air for exactly the amount of time it deserved, and then said in the measured voice of a man who had rehearsed this too, "Thomas, I appreciate the effort, but I need you to understand something clearly. We are not negotiating around a single incident tonight. We are closing a chapter that should have been closed 5 years ago, and the way it closes is not by reducing Connolly's pension and calling it done." He opened to a specific page in his binder. "The union has signed sealing paperwork on 4 complaints, all of which describe conduct substantively identical to what happened at Harrington's. Those complaints were sealed. Those complainants were left with no remedy. And now we have federal charges video evidence from 6 devices, testimony from a 4-star admiral, and the documented presence of Officer Connolly at the location of a restaurant that was not on his patrol route for 6 minutes before the dispatch call he used to justify his approach." He looked at Greer. "There is no negotiation here. There is only what the record requires." Greer looked at his client. Connolly was looking at the table. He had been looking at the table since the first document was laid in front of him, with the focused attention of a man who had discovered that the surface of a table in a room like this had a particular capacity for absorbing a gaze that did not want to be anywhere else. He had the look of someone who had always believed with complete certainty that the system would catch him if he fell. Not in the sense of catching him doing something wrong, but in the sense of catching him and holding him, supporting him, absorbing whatever he needed it to absorb, and who was encountering for the first time the specific vertigo of discovering that the net he had been counting on was not there. The formal findings were read aloud by Walsh. Immediate termination effective the date of the incident. Forfeiture of pension benefits in their entirety pursuant to the department's misconduct provisions. Referral to the United States Attorney's Office for federal prosecution. Permanent revocation of law enforcement credentials in the Commonwealth of Virginia with a referral to the National Law Enforcement Credential Registry for notation. Each finding was read in the flat, clean language of institutional consequence, not with drama, not with triumph, just the specific language of a record being made, a set of consequences being named and logged. Connolly was escorted from the conference room at 10:41 a.m. He did not look back as he went through the door. What he carried out with him and what would stay with him in the particular way that things you have earned stay with you was not injustice, but the precise, documented, meticulously assembled weight of what he had chosen to do accumulated over 14 years and arrived at last. The footage had been circulating for 72 hours before the hearing, and by the time Connolly walked out of the conference room on the 10th floor of the municipal building, it had been viewed a number of times that had stopped being a meaningful metric and had started being simply a fact about the world, a thing that existed now permanently in the record of things that had happened. The responses were not uniform, and the non-uniformity was its own kind of data. There was the retired police captain from Columbus, Ohio, who posted a 4-minute video response in which he named one by one every specific procedural failure visible in the footage, and concluded quietly and without rancor that what he saw was not a mistake, but a demonstration of an attitude that the profession could not afford and had protected for too long. The video was watched 2 million times in 48 hours. There was the woman in Richmond who recognized Connolly's walk, the specific aggressive posture of his approach across the dining room, because she had been on the other end of it 2 years before. Her son, 17, stopped outside their own apartment complex till he matched a description. Searched, released without charge, and told by a union rep when she filed the complaint that these things sometimes happened in active investigations. She had filed the complaint. It had gone nowhere. Watching the footage now, she felt something she had difficulty naming exactly, not satisfaction, but something in the vicinity of being told, after a very long time, that she had been right. Leon Harrington's waiter gave a single interview to the Norfolk Courier-Tribune, requested specifically because the reporter covering the story had, with an instinct she would later describe as the only good journalistic decision she'd made that year, noticed his name in Pierre's written account and tracked him down. Leon was careful and specific and modest in the way of someone who understood that what he had witnessed was significant and who wanted to represent it accurately. He said Mr. Okafor had been one of the most composed people he had ever served, and that the composure had not looked like suppression but like something built over years, and that watching it had taught him something he was still figuring out how to use. Pierre gave a statement to the press, 2 paragraphs formal, precise, in the English of a man who had learned it as an adult, and who therefore chose his words with a specificity that native speakers often didn't bother with. He described the evening, accurately named what he had witnessed, and concluded with the observation, quiet, almost offhand, that he had been writing things down for 30 years in this country and in others, because he had learned that the difference between what happened and what was recorded was often the difference between what could be proven and what could be denied, and that everyone in every position of potential witness had a responsibility to be one. The statement was reproduced in full in 4 major outlets. Admiral Holt gave one brief statement in front of the steps of the Naval Station Norfolk headquarters, declining all follow-up questions. He described what he had witnessed as clearly and specifically as a man trained in precise reporting could describe it. He named what it was without euphemism, and expressed his complete and unconditional confidence in Commander Okafor. He answered one follow-up question from a reporter who asked how he would characterize the officer's behavior, by saying, with the patient, unhurried finality of someone who has given the question its full consideration, as a man who has spent 40 years studying what authority is and what it is for, I would characterize it as a misunderstanding of both. David Okafor gave no statement, by choice. Through his JAG attorney, who issued a 1-sentence notice that Commander Okafor would not be making public comments while the federal proceeding was active, a legally appropriate choice that also happened to be for those watching closely. Completely consistent with the man himself, the same discipline, the same deliberate silence, the same refusal to perform his own vindication for an audience. The 4 prior complainants, Marcus Dillard, Dr. Carl Pemberton, Reggie Tate, James Ossie, were contacted by multiple journalists, and some of them spoke and some of them didn't. And what united the ones who did speak was not the anger which was present and real, but something beneath the anger. The specific, exhausted relief of people who had been carrying the word unsubstantiated in their records for years, and were watching now as someone finally looked at what they had reported and said, yes. We see it. It was real. The federal courtroom of the Eastern District of Virginia was not by any standard of judicial architecture an impressive room. It had been built in 1987 during a period when the federal budget for courthouse construction had been oriented toward function over statement, and it showed in the plain wood paneling and the fluorescent fixtures that had been upgraded twice since installation, but still carried the slightly institutional quality of light that had never quite been asked to do more than illuminate, which suited Judge Harold Beaumont perfectly. He was 64 years old. White-haired, appointed to the federal bench by 2 presidents of different parties, which was in the current climate its own kind of credential. And he had been on the bench for 19 years, during which time he had developed through the accumulation of every kind of human situation. A federal court encounters a reputation for one specific quality that prosecutors and defense attorneys both described in almost identical language. He was fair in the specific, rigorous sense of a man who had examined what fairness actually required and had decided to do that regardless of how it landed. He had received the Connolly case without comment and had read the entire file in 2 evenings. Brett Connolly sat at the defense table in the same gray suit, not the same individual suit he had bought, a second one, but the same category of suit, the same quality, the same fit. And the 9 months between the incident and the sentencing had done something to him that the hearing room had started. They had reduced him not in height or weight, but in presence in the particular quality of occupying space that he had spent 14 years cultivating the belief in his own specific gravity. His attorney, young, thorough, clearly talented, had built the defense around a single-word mistake and had placed it carefully in the center of every argument, surrounded it with context and history and the language of rehabilitation and remorse, and Connolly had been coached to hold his face a certain way and to speak at a certain register when addressing the court, and he was doing all of this with the competence of a man who had learned in 9 months that performance was what the situation required. The prosecution had completed its case. The evidence was established, the dispatch logs, the 911 audio. Tyler Bowen's arrest report. The prior 4 complaints. The smartphone footage. The testimony of Pierre and Leon, and 3 other witnesses from the dining room. The expert testimony of a former police chief from Dallas on what the documented pattern of conduct represented in terms of professional standard. What remained was the sentencing. And the sentencing statement. In the gallery, Chief Walsh, who had attended every day. Captain Mercer, who had attended the days when testimony was heard. Special Agent Bowen, who had a flight to D.C. at 4 and had decided to push it to 6. Thomas Greer, who had arrived alone and was sitting in the back row and was looking at his hands. And in the 3rd row from the front, in a charcoal suit pressed, fitted the suit of a man who takes care of what he owns. David Okafor sat with the same stillness that had characterized every moment he had occupied since the night at Harrington's, his back straight, his hands in his lap, his eyes on the room in the same slow peripheral sweep that never fully left him even here. Connolly noticed him when he sat down. He had been looking at the defense table when the gallery began to fill, and something in his peripheral vision had drawn his eye, not movement exactly, but a quality of stillness that was distinguishable from the other kinds of stillness in the room. And he had looked and found David Okafor, and held the eye contact for exactly 2 seconds before looking away. And what passed between them in those 2 seconds was not triumph on one side and defeat on the other. It was something simpler and in its simplicity more final recognition. One man who had spent 14 years believing his badge made him more than what he was looking at the man he had tried to diminish in a restaurant on a Friday night and understanding with the specific irrefutable clarity that comes from 9 months of documentation and consequence and 2 seconds of eye contact the size of his error. Judge Beaumont entered at 9:14. The room came to order. The prosecution's final summation was not about the night at Harrington's. It was about the 14 years that preceded it, and the way those years laid out in sequence produced an argument that no single incident, however documented, could have produced alone, because the argument was about pattern, and patterns are what a single moment cannot refute. The 4 prior complainants had testified earlier in the proceeding. Not in graphic detail, the prosecution had made a deliberate choice to keep each testimony short, clean, specific, but in the human particularity of a people describing an experience that they had lived. Marcus Dillard, the middle school principal, stopped in the parking lot of the school where he had worked for 11 years, told he matched a description of a man suspected of stealing from a nearby pharmacy, subjected to a search of his vehicle, released without charge. His school security badge was in his jacket pocket throughout. He had filed a complaint and received 6 weeks later a letter saying the complaint had been reviewed and no action warranted. Dr. Carl Pemberton, the emergency physician, stopped in the parking structure of Norfolk General Hospital, where he had been on staff for 9 years, told he matched a description, searched, released. He had his hospital ID lanyard around his neck. He had filed a complaint and received the same letter. Reggie Tate, the building contractor, stopped on a job site he owned in a neighborhood he had worked in for 12 years, told he matched a description. His company van with his name on the side was parked 10 feet away. He did not file a complaint because by that point he had spoken to two people who had, and he knew what the letter said. James Osei, the grandfather, stopped while walking his 7-year-old granddaughter to school on a Tuesday morning. His granddaughter was holding his hand. He was told he matched a description of a man suspected of a burglary the previous evening. He was searched on a public sidewalk in front of his granddaughter and released. His granddaughter had asked him that evening why the policeman made him put his hands on the car. He had told her he didn't know. The prosecution concluded by asking the court to consider not just what Brett Connolly had done at Harrington's Steakhouse on one specific Friday night, but what these 4 testimonies combined with the documented evidence revealed about the nature of the conduct in question. Not an error, not a lapse, not a moment of confusion, but a repeated practice documented across 5 years, protected by institutional machinery, visited upon men who were alone when it happened, who complained when they were able, and who were told in the flat language of a form letter that nothing warranted action. The defense attorney rose and asked the court to consider the totality of Connolly's service 12 years without a sustained complaint. Commendations in his first 3 years. A man who had in other contexts done his job adequately, and to weigh that service against the documented incidents, and to find in that weighing some space for a consequence that did not end in federal imprisonment. It was, by the standards of the argument available to him, a reasonable attempt. Walsh in the gallery watched it and kept his face neutral. Then the prosecution rose for its rebuttal and said quietly the thing that needed to be said, that years of service during which the documented misconduct occurred were not years that mitigated the misconduct. They were years in which the misconduct was protected, concealed, and repeated. Every one of those years was a year in which a man used a badge as a weapon, and every one of those years this court was now responsible for weighing. The recording from the holding cell was played. Connolly's phone call to Thomas Greer from the night of the incident at 11:17 p.m., recorded as part of the standard processing of an officer on administrative hold, played for 43 seconds. And in those 43 seconds, Connolly's voice moved from the performance of appropriate distress to something more direct. Something that said, with the specific clarity of a man speaking to someone he trusted completely, "I need you to make this go away, and this is what we're going to say." It was, and you've done it before. The recording ended. The room was very quiet. Connolly was permitted a statement before sentencing. He stood at the defense table and read from a page the reading of a man who had memorized the words but was reading them anyway because the reading was its own form of the performance. And the words were carefully organized around the central claim that he had made a mistake, that the mistake had cost him everything he had built, that he had lost his career and was losing his family, and that he was asking the court from the position of a man who had already lost a great deal to consider leniency. The word mistake appeared 4 times in 2 minutes. Judge Beaumont listened to all of it without moving. When Connolly finished and sat down, Beaumont looked at him for a moment, a long, unhurried, specifically attentive moment, and then he opened the file in front of him, which he had been reading from throughout the proceeding, and he said, "Mr. Connolly, I'd like to respond to the word you used several times in your statement, the word mistake." His voice was not loud and not theatrical. It was the voice of a man who had something specific to say and was going to say it in the most direct and accurate language available. A mistake is a misreading of a situation. A mistake is misremembering a street name or taking an action based on incomplete information that later proves to be wrong. What you did, Mr. Connolly, as documented in this record, is not a mistake. It is a practice. It is a pattern of deliberate conduct repeated across 5 years, targeting a specific population protected by institutional mechanisms, and continued, even escalated on the evening of the 17th. When you chose a man approached him and attempted to physically remove him from a restaurant based on no evidence except his appearance in a place you had decided he did not belong. He turned a page. "I want to say the names of 4 men: Marcus Dillard, Dr. Carl Pemberton, Reggie Tate, James Osei." He said each name with the measured, deliberate weight of someone who understands that the saying of a name is its own kind of acknowledgement. These men filed complaints. They used the system that was available to them, and the system at every point declined to hear them. This court today is part of that system, And part of what this sentencing is required to do is acknowledge explicitly that those complaints were correct, that the pattern they described was real, and that the men who made them were owed a response that they were not given. He looked at Connolly again. Your attorney has asked me to weigh years of service against the documented conduct. I want to be direct about why I cannot do that in the way he is asking. The years of service are not separate from the documented conduct. They are the context in which the documented conduct occurred and repeated. Each year is not a credit against the misconduct. Each year is a year in which the misconduct was present and protected and practiced. This is not a man who served well for a long time and then made a mistake at the end. This is about a man who was permitted to operate in a way that harmed people for a long time because the mechanisms designed to stop that were not functioning. He picked up his pen. The court also notes for the record the conduct of Commander David Okafor throughout these proceedings, his composure on the evening in question, his restraint in the public period after the incident, and his presence here today, and finds in that conduct a demonstration of something that bears naming: the specific sustained discipline of a man who chose under circumstances in which a different response would have been completely understandable to let the record speak for itself. The record has spoken. He opened the sentencing page. Gregory Allen Connolly. It is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a term of 96 months, 8 years. This sentence is to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are subject to the forfeiture of all pension and retirement benefits accrued during your service pursuant to the misconduct provisions applicable to federal convictions during the course of official duties. Your law enforcement credentials are permanently revoked in all jurisdictions, and a notation of this conviction is to be entered in the National Law Enforcement Registry, effective immediately. He picked up the gavel. You are remanded to the immediate custody of the United States Marshal Service. The gavel came down. The sound was not by itself remarkable, a piece of wood striking a wooden surface, a sound that this room produced on many days for many reasons. But in the specific silence of the moment it landed in, it had a quality of finality that filled the room completely, and for a long moment after it, no one moved. The 2 federal marshals stepped forward. The handcuffs, steel, a standard issue, the same model that Connolly had carried on his own duty belt for 14 years, closed around his wrists with a sound that was in this room and at this moment identical to the sound they would have made at Table 9 months ago if Connolly had managed to put them on David Okafor. The same metal, the same click, the same weight. David Okafor in the 3rd row of the gallery heard the sound. His hands in his lap were still. He did not smile. He did not look away. He simply sat and heard it and let it mean what it meant. The Virginia sunlight hit them both as they came through the front doors of the courthouse hard mid-morning, the specific brightness of a late spring day that does not negotiate. And for a moment both men stopped on the top step and let it do what it did. The media was at the bottom of the steps. 3 cameras, 2 reporters with microphones. A cluster of people with phones raised not the enormous press presence that the early weeks of the story had generated, but the persistent professional attention of people whose job was to document the end of something. David did not stop. He moved down the steps at an even pace, Holt slightly behind him, and to his right the position David had noticed that Holt had occupied in his life for 15 years, slightly behind, and to the right, close enough to intervene, and far enough away to give David the room he needed. And the reporters called questions, and the cameras tracked them, and David walked through all of it without breaking stride or altering his expression, the same composure that had characterized every public moment of this story from the first. Holt said nothing until they reached the bottom of the steps and had moved through the press cluster to the open space of the courthouse plaza. Then, he said quietly in the voice he used when he was not performing anything for anyone, "It's done, David." David walked for another 3 steps before he responded. "Yes, sir," he said, "it is." Nothing more. But the specific weight of those 3 words, "Yes, sir," it has carried 15 years in them. And Holt heard all of it, and they walked on. At the top of the courthouse steps in the sunlight the 4 men had come. Not as a group, they had not coordinated, had not discussed it, but separately, each arriving by his own route and for his own reasons, standing not together but in the loose, unregimented way of people who have been called individually by the same thing. Marcus Dillard, the principal, in a dark coat. Dr. Carl Pemberton in the clothes of a man who had come from work. Reggie Tate in a work jacket with his company logo on the chest. James Ossie, who was 81 and had taken a bus and who was standing very straight the way he always stood. David saw them as he crossed the plaza. He did not wave, did not call to them. He simply walked toward them in a slight adjustment of direction, barely perceptible. And as he passed each man, he met each man's eyes, and what passed in each of those meetings was not triumph or relief, or the completion of something long sought, but the specific quiet acknowledgement of people who have been through the same weather in different conditions, and who know, without needing to say it, that what happened today was real, and that being real, being documented, being believed, being named, matters. He passed all four of them. He did not stop. He kept walking. And Leon was there too, standing at the edge of the plaza in his civilian clothes, a young man who had driven 3 hours from Norfolk and had taken a personal day from work and had not told anyone where he was going. And when David passed him, Leon did not speak, and David did not speak, and the two men looked at each other for 1 second in the morning light, and whatever passed between them in that second was something that would stay with Leon for a long time, and he would think about it on the days when his work felt small, and it would remind him that it was not. David and Holt reached the car. Holt opened his door. David stood by the passenger side for a moment in the sunlight with his hands in his pockets and his face turned slightly upward, not toward anything specific, not a gesture toward the sky or the city or any particular thing, just the simple act of a man standing in the open air in the light after a long time indoors. He had a deployment briefing in 11 days. He was thinking about it already, the names of the men he would be leading, the specific things he knew about each of them, the particular responsibilities he carried for each. Because that was where his mind lived, not in the past, but in the forward-facing obligation of a man who led people and who understood that leading people was the thing that required everything he had and returned in kind everything that mattered. He got in the car. The badge was returned to the department in a plastic evidence bag sealed with a numbered tag processed by a clerk in the records office on the second floor of the precinct who had been a clerk in this office for 11 years, and who wrote the case number on the tag with the same unhurried precision she applied to every piece of property she logged because the machinery of consequence when it finally moves is indistinguishable in its motions from the machinery of ordinary administration. The bag was labeled evidence and filed in the property room between a box of seized electronics and a tray of tagged keys. That was the end of the badge. A pension letter arrived at the house on Colleton Road 3 weeks after sentencing in a standard white envelope with the city seal in the upper left corner. The kind of envelope that arrives in any mailbox on any day and looks like nothing until it is opened. Patricia Connolly had been staying in the house through the proceeding for the children's sake, managing the particular logistics of a family in the middle of a public collapse with a competence and quietness that the children would not understand for years. She brought the mail in from the box, sorted it on the kitchen table. Bill's school notices a catalog and reached the city envelope last. She read the first paragraph, set the envelope on the table, walked out of the kitchen. On the table beside the catalog in the school notices the letter sat in the mid-morning light of a room that was half-packed, the shelves showing the rectangular ghosts of removed picture frames, the counter bearing the clean circles where appliances had stood, and the letter was both ordinary and total, in the way that the ending of a thing always is ordinary in its form and total in its meaning. FC. Petersburg received Connolly at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning. Processing was standard property inventoried and stored civilian clothing replaced identification photograph taken, number assigned. The number replaced the name in the operational context of the facility, which was a fact that the facility experienced as administrative and which Connolly experienced differently. He had worked in buildings with locked doors for 14 years. He understood locks, their weight, their mechanism, the specific sound they made when engaged. He had heard that sound many times from the outside. The doors here were the same weight. The locks made the same sound. He had a bunk in a cell that he shared with one other person, and above the bunk scratched into the paint with something small and sharp by a previous occupant. In a previous year, 2 words had been carved. It matters. He read them the first morning. He read them every morning after that. And they meant each time something slightly different, as though the words were not fixed, but responding to where he was in his understanding of things, which was slow and incomplete and ongoing in the way that genuine understanding usually is. On the outside, the ripples moved. Marcus Dillard went back to teaching. He added a unit to his 8th grade social studies curriculum on the history of civil rights enforcement in America, specifically on how accountability works when it works, and what prevents it from working when it doesn't. He did not name the case. He didn't need to. Dr. Carl Pemberton established a small legal fund, modest initially operating out of a shared office in a community health building for men and women who had experienced unlawful stops and searches and who could not afford to pursue the complaints without help. The fund received 47 applications in its first year. Reggie Tate's granddaughter, who was 16 now and paying close attention, wrote a school paper about the case and won a county writing award for it. He kept the ribbon on the refrigerator. James Osai's granddaughter, who was 9, now asked him one evening at the kitchen table whether the policeman had ever said sorry. He thought about it for a moment. The court said it, he told her. She considered this. Is that the same? She asked. He sat with the question for a while in the comfortable, unhurried way of an 81-year-old man who has learned that some questions are better held than answered quickly, and said finally, "It's not the same, but it's something." She seemed to find this acceptable. They finished their dinner. 6 months after the sentencing, in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the Norfolk Police Department headquarters, a room with windows specifically chosen by Chief Walsh for this occasion. Because he wanted the people in the room to be able to see the city, when the announcement was made, the Norfolk Police Department formally adopted a set of operational reforms that would govern civilian stops, physical description-based approaches, and complaint review processes effective immediately. The announcement was made on a Wednesday morning. Walsh stood at the front of the room with a 3-page document in his hands and a room behind him that included in the front row Marcus Dillard, Doctor, Carl Pemberton, Reggie Tate, and James Osei, who had been personally called by Walsh the week before, and who had been asked to come not as representatives of anything or as speakers, but simply as people who had a reason to be present when this particular thing was announced. 3 of the 4 came. James Osei was there sitting very straight in a dark suit and a tie that his granddaughter had straightened for him that morning and declared satisfactory. Walsh read the reforms. Mandatory body-worn camera activation for all civilian stops with footage reviewed by an independent board within 72 hours of any complaint. An independent civilian oversight board established by city ordinance with investigative authority, not advisory authority. Investigative authority to review and subpoena records in any complaint involving use of force, unlawful detention, or racially discriminatory targeting. A new review process for any stop conducted on the basis of a physical description alone, requiring secondary supervisory approval within 48 hours and notification of the individual stopped, and a standing requirement written into the operational protocol named permanent that all field training and civilian encounter procedures be conducted using the case of the Harrington's incident as a baseline document. The protocol was titled at Walsh's specific request the Caldwell-Holt Operational Directive on Civilian Encounter Standards. He said both names clearly when he announced the title. Dillard in the front row looked at the floor for a moment. Pemberton folded his hands. Tate nodded once slowly, the nod of a man filing something away in a place where it would stay. Osei sat straight and looked at the front of the room with the particular steady attention of an 81-year-old man who has been waiting a long time for something and who is not going to miss a single second of it now that it has arrived. Walsh concluded by writing a statement which he had written himself at his desk at 11 o'clock the previous night, which said in part that the department had failed, that the complaint processes had been used against the people they were designed to protect, and that what happened at Harrington's Steakhouse on a Friday night in November was not the story of one bad officer, but the story of a deeply embedded failure of institutional accountability that had been permitted, protected, and continued for years. He read the names of all 5 men: David Okafor, Marcus Dillard, Dr. Carl Pemberton, Reggie Tate, James Ossie. He read them in alphabetical order because in this context, the context of an institution acknowledging what it owed putting one name above another would have been its own kind of failure. The Caldwell-Holt Directive went into effect the following Monday and was adopted as a model protocol by 3 police academies in the following year. Leon got his associate's degree in criminal justice 11 months after that Friday night at Harrington's, graduating at the top of his class in a ceremony that his mother attended, and that he had thought about sometimes on the nights when studying had been hard and the work had felt distant from anything real. He was currently in his 2nd month of an internship with the Norfolk Civilian Oversight Board. He had not expected the internship to move him the way it did the specific unglamorous paperwork and process work of reviewing complaints, reading transcripts, noting discrepancies, building the record that made accountability possible. But it moved him every day with the weight of understanding that this work was what the 4 men in the front row of Walsh's conference room had needed someone to do years ago, and what no one had done. He intended to keep doing it. Pierre was still at Harrington's. He had declined 3 interview requests, 2 speaking invitations, and 1 offer from a publisher who wanted to develop his written account of the evening into something larger, which he had read carefully and declined without explanation. Because his account of the evening was what it needed, to be precise, complete time-stamped, and adding anything to it would be its own kind of distortion. He had framed a copy of his handwritten notes from that night and hung it in the back office of the restaurant, not on the dining room wall, not in any space visible to customers, but in the office where the staff took their breaks and reviewed their schedules because it belonged to the people who worked here, not to the people who dined. He was asked once by a young server who was new to the staff why it was there. He said, "Because you write things down. Because what you see matters. Because if you work in a room where people are, you are a witness, and being a witness is a responsibility." The server read the framed page. Then she went back to work. Admiral Holt retired 8 months after the sentencing at a ceremony held at Naval Station Norfolk on a clear October morning with 400 people in attendance. He had refused a larger ceremony and had specifically requested that the guest list be kept to people who had worked with him, no political figures, no ceremonial additions. David spoke. It was the only speech David gave during this entire period, and it lasted 6 minutes. And it was about the specific, concrete experience of being led by someone who showed you by example every day what it looked like to take your responsibilities seriously without mistaking them for your identity, and what it meant for the people led by such a man to have that example available when they needed it. Holt, sitting in the front row, looked at the floor for most of it. He was asked later by a reporter who had been present how he had felt listening to it. He said, "Grateful and honest about what I should have done more and sooner." The apartment was quiet. David had been home for 2 days, not long, but enough to sleep in a bed and eat food he had cooked himself and sit for an evening with nothing required of him, which was a thing he needed more often than he allowed himself to take it. The television was on without sound, a news broadcast running its scroll of the day's things, and he was eating takeout from a place 3 blocks away that had been there when he moved into the building 4 years ago, and that he was glad was still there because consistency in small things was its own form of stability. The charcoal suit was in the open closet. Dry cleaned, pressed, hanging in its plastic protective sleeve on the left side of the closet where his good suits lived, 2 others beside it. 1 navy, 1 black, with the care of a man who did not have many occasions for a charcoal suit, and who therefore took care of the one he had because taking care of things was its own practice, its own statement about how you moved through the world. He thought about the deployment, not with dread, not with anticipation, but with the specific practical attention that was his natural mode. The names of the men, their particular histories, the things he knew about each of them that would matter in the field. There was a young lieutenant named Reeves, 26 first deployment in a significant operational role, who had the instincts, but not yet the patience, which was the specific combination that required the most careful kind of attention from the people above him. David had been thinking about Reeves on and off for 2 weeks, turning over different approaches looking for the one that would be most useful. He did not think about Connolly. Not deliberately, not in suppression. It was simply that Connolly was not part of the architecture of his life, had never been. Had been a weather event that passed through one specific Friday and had been processed by the machinery of consequence and was now in its proper place in the record, and the record was where it belonged. He thought briefly about James Osei, the 81-year-old who had stood very straight outside the courthouse in the spring sunlight and whose granddaughter had asked him whether the policeman had said sorry, and who had told her with the patience of long experience that the court had said it. The thought stayed with him. He was not sure he had more to add to it than Osei did. He finished his dinner. He watched the soundless news for a while. At 10:30, he turned the television off and went to the bedroom to pack a practiced, methodical process, the same list in the same order. The bag that went on every deployment organized the same way because the sameness was its own form of preparation. The closet was open. The charcoal suit hung in its sleeve, pressed and still in the particular patience of a thing that belongs to someone who will come back for it. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about Harrington's, not the confrontation, not Connolly, not the courtroom, but the table. The amber light, the oysters, and the second place setting, waiting for someone who would come, and the way the jazz trio had been playing something slow and questioning in the corner, and the way the room had felt before, everything else, like a place that had been carefully prepared to receive people with dignity and that had on that specific evening been tested on whether it meant it. It had meant it. He thought about that. Then he zipped the bag, checked the time, and carried it to the front door. He put on his jacket. He turned off the light. He locked the deadbolt, the same deliberate, unhurried turn of the key, the same hands, the same patience, and walked down the hallway to the elevator and into the morning and toward the work. Behind him, in the dark apartment in the open closet, the charcoal suit hung in its sleeve. Still. Waiting. For the next thing worth celebrating. This story is a fictional dramatization created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters' names, incidents, locations, and organizations depicted in this story are entirely fictitious. Any resemblance to real persons living or dead or to actual events is purely coincidental. If this story hit home for you, if you called out to the screen, if you waited for that moment when the truth finally caught up, then you already know why we tell these stories. Hit that like button right now. It means more than you think. Share this with someone who needs to see that dignity doesn't require a title, and that the record, when it's kept carefully, always speaks. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell because we have more stories coming and you don't want to miss a single one. And tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest tonight. We read every one.